committed faculty with national and international exposure, working towards creating an enabling environment for the research and academic excellence. The department is truly the reflection of unity in diversity. The students come from across the country, bringing along the diversity and plurality to the classroom that enriches the teaching learning experience. The department offers intellectually stimulating programs that encourages research and critical thinking on contemporary political issues with a view of creating socially responsible and politically aware citizens. The monthly lecture series organized by department is one such step in pursuit of intellectual excellence, which unites the best academicians, activists, and practitioners from all over the country and the world. It aims to provide a unique experience to students, teachers, and scholars, continuing with the same tradition. Today we have Professor Sobhanlal Datta Gupta, former SN Banerjee Chair, Professor of Political Science, Calcutta University, to share his thoughts on the political philosophy of Jürgen Habermas. I would request Dr. Manisha Madhavan, Head of the Department of Political Science, to deliver the welcome note to our Honorable Speaker. Ma'am.
Thank you, Shweta, for that very kind introduction, or although unnecessary introduction of mine. It's a pleasure to welcome on board Professor Sobhanlal Datta Gupta. Must mention here that Professor Datta Gupta, SDG as we used to call him when we were students, has been my teacher as well. And it is a moment of great pride that I have had the opportunity to invite him to give lecture to my students. So thank you so much, sir, for accepting this invitation and for gracing this occasion. I'm truly indebted to you. I take this opportunity to share a few, snippets of my college day, taking me back to memory lane. Professor Dasgupta's classes used to be one of the most riveting classes that we had in our master's degree course. And in Calcutta University, and those I think were the golden days of Calcutta University, he was one of the most popular professors. The entire classroom used to be full of students for his lectures, not just because he brought solid content and erudition into the classrooms, but the simple manner in which he was able to communicate some of the most complex concepts of international relation theory or political philosophy to all of us. I wanted my students to have a taste of my teacher, and that is how the pandemic in a way has come as a blessing. In the sense that without leaving our home, we are able to connect with Professor Gupta in Kolkata and we here in Mumbai. So welcome, sir. Very warm welcome to you, to the Department of Political Science, SNDT Women's University. And it's indeed a great pleasure for me personally and for the department. It's a matter of great honor to have you with us here today and to speak on the subject of Habermas, who is one of the most influential political philosophers who has had a major impact on a variety of disciplines, who has been extensively critiqued, and interestingly, the critique itself has promoted very productive discussions on liberal democracy, on civil society, on public life in the 20th century. In fact, there are few scholars who have been so seriously debated as Habermas has been. But today we hope to hear from you as to how Habermas, he continues to be relevant in an age of social media, on digital democracy, on expanding, or I do not know whether expanding, contracting public sphere. So to speak on this very important subject, we could not have had anybody other than you. Welcome to the Department of Political Science, sir. Welcome to SNDT Women's University. And we would be happy, we are extremely proud to be here with us here today. Before we begin, Shweta, can you please introduce Professor Gupta? Although everybody knows him, but for the sake of the students, we need to know his long list of achievements.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. It is indeed an honor to have Professor Sobhanlal Datta Gupta to share his thoughts today evening on the political philosophy of Jürgen Habermas. Professor Gupta is former SN Banerjee Chair, Professor of Political Science, Calcutta University, a position which he held for almost a decade from 1998 to 2008. He's an eminent scholar of Marxism and the author of the book Marxism in Dark Times, Select Essays for the New Century. He has held numerous visiting positions. He was visiting scholar at the Charles Wallace Trust Scholarship, Manchester University, UK in 2002, at the Center of Modern Orient, Berlin in 1998, and visiting fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies, Moscow in 1995. Professor Gupta has numerous publications to his credit, which include Justice and Political Order in India, Commentary on India and the Colonial Questions, Commentary and Destiny of Communism in India, Rosa Luxemburg and her Critics, Dialectics of Real and Possible History. He is co-editor of Indo-Russian Relations 1917 to 1947, which is a compilation of select documents from the archives of Russian Federation. He has also edited a documented history of communist movement in India and written platforms, Stalin and the crisis of proletariat dictatorship. He is also the author of numerous articles which have been cited by multiple scholars and intellectuals. He was the coordinator of DRS program, that is the Departmental Research Support, awarded by UGC in 2006. The successful completion under his guidance paved way for the second phase of DRS program. The UGC has recognized this DRS program as one of the best run DRS in political science. Overall, Professor Gupta has 38 works in 90 publications in 3 languages and 2,160 library holdings. He is currently working on his book, The Socialist Vision and the Silenced Voices of Democracy. It gives me great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Gupta on the behalf of Department of Political Science, SNDT Women's University. I would like to welcome Professor Gupta amongst us today to share his thoughts. Sir.
Uh, a very warm, uh, good afternoon or good evening. I do not I do not exactly know what's the time in Bombay now, but anyway, we are perhaps in a twilight zone now. So, uh, with these words, I first of all appreciate your great effort in the sense that you have invited me to speak on a subject, or rather on a theme, which I think is extremely complex, but at the same time extremely topical. As your head of the department, Manisha, my former student, has already pointed out, I fully agree with her that as Habermas, of course, is of great topical importance today. We have to keep in mind that he is now 92, because he was born in 1929, has very much, he's still alive and kicking, and he's still, say, writing, attending conferences. How it is possible, I don't know at the age of 92. But anyway, now, before I go into the main theme, I should, I think at the very beginning, express my deep thanks to all of you, organizers of this lecture, for inviting me to speak on this subject, and for the generous, very kind words you have spoken about me. But I don't think I really deserve all these things. I've always tried to be a teacher, humble teacher, in the sense that whatever I say, talk about in the class, it should be understandable. It should be properly communicated to the students. And in fact, that way, when I tried to communicate in my own way in the classroom years back, I had very little understanding of Habermas. Habermas's main theme is communication. distortion-free communication, how you can transmit your ideas to others, and how others can transmit their ideas to you. So communication that way, I think, is, yes, it is very relevant. It is relevant for Habermas, and without reading Habermas, well, for me, it has always been a challenge. That is, how to communicate the ideas that I have in mind to the students, to the listeners. So with these words, I now begin, and you have already got the main theme, the title of my lecture. Now, please take note of one thing, that Habermas is a very, very, I would say, many themes on so many areas. He has covered, say, philosophy, sociology, political science, so many areas of, say, our thoughts, our knowledge, that it is very, very difficult to sum up Habermas. And I will not try also to do this kind of thing. So I will primarily concentrate on a political philosophy of Habermas, and that's how I have titled it. That is how Habermas has fused politics and philosophy in his ideas, and I will just try. I cannot guarantee that I will that it will really be meaningful to you. I will try to make it meaningful to all of you. Now, Habermas, I think, can be treated, so far as his political philosophy is concerned. He can be treated, and maybe he should be treated, say, at 4 levels. This is how I have structured my lecture. First of all, and that is very, very important, that is the background of Habermas. Because the one problem which quite often, I think, those who read Habermas, they have to face or they have to confront. And in fact, this is the kind of complaint I have quite often come across, that that Habermas is extremely difficult. Habermas is difficult to comprehend, to make at times head or tail of what he is saying. And his ideas are spread in so many books, so many of his writings, that it is impossible, first of all, to read. In fact, if you ask me that, have you read Habermas? No, I must admit I haven't read all of Habermas. I have tried to read, I have tried to understand some of his central representative texts, not all of them. And as I said, the main problem is, and this is the kind of difficulty that quite often we face, is that we do not know exactly the background of Habermas. So that will be my first part. That is, I will very briefly explain the background of Habermas. Because that background, in fact, if you listen to this background a bit carefully, then perhaps it will not be very difficult for you to understand that it is, in fact, in this background that many of the clues to the understanding of Habermas, these are located. So that is very important. That is my first thing that I will try to cover. Second, some of his central concepts. There are many concepts which Habermas has developed, Habermas has introduced, but some of his central key concepts, which actually constitute the core of his political philosophy. So that will be my second part. In the third part, and that is a very controversial aspect of Habermas's thought, that is Habermas's negotiation with Marxism. Why? Because Habermas initially, in fact, in many of his interviews, Habermas has stated very clearly, very candidly, that I had a real fascination for Marx. And in my young life, in my young days, I was deeply influenced by Marx's writings, especially the writings of young Marx on alienation, freedom, etc. But then Habermas, gradually over the years, there took place a shift in his understanding of Marxism. While definitely maintaining his respect for Marx, he later raised a number of questions concerning Marx, and that made Habermas's views on Marxism extremely controversial. So that will be my third part. And in the fourth and final part, I will try to cover, perhaps not very extensively, but I will try to very briefly discuss, explain some of the responses which Habermas's writings have evoked over the years. Because Habermas, yes, he has written very extensively, rise to many questions, critiques, controversies, polemics, exactly debates. That is, Habermas has been interrogated. Habermas's ideas have been questioned. So, what are these debates all about? So, these I will very briefly try to cover. So, this more or less is the structure of my lecture. Now, let me quickly, first of all, take a look at his background. Now, the background is very interesting. Habermas, as I have already mentioned, he was born in the year 1929. And we have to keep in mind that Habermas grew up as a young man in fascist Germany, in Nazi Germany. He was a product that way of the Nazi era. Habermas, in fact, had to join the war also as a member of the Hitler Youth. So obviously the question arises that since he was born and brought up in fascist Germany, so how the Nazi era impacted him? Did the Nazi era in which he lived, which he witnessed directly, what kind of impression that Nazi era left on him? Now, the answer is very clear. Habermas, in many of his interviews, has explained this point. That yes, he was born in Nazi Germany, he grew up in fascist Germany, and he had a direct encounter of fascism, although in the English translations of Habermas's interviews, which are available, I don't know whether there is anything else in Habermas's any other interview which has not been published, which has not been translated in English. That is, the point to be noted is that Habermas has not very extensively spoken about his experience of the fascist era. We do not come across this kind of, say, observation of Habermas, how he viewed the Nazi era. But what is very significant, what is very interesting is that Habermas, right from the very beginning, and especially after the end of the Nazi period in 1945, when the Second World War came to an end, what we come across in Habermas's writings, in many of his interviews, is this. That is, he is an uncompromising opponent of fascism, authoritarian rule. And he's a champion of democracy. Democracy, liberal values, pluralism. So all those values which just stand opposed to fascism, Nazism, any kind of, say, authoritarian rule. So this is a point which we have to keep in mind, so far as his background is concerned. Very strongly opposed to fascism, very strongly opposed to war. So this is one very important thing we have to keep in mind. Second, his negotiation with the Frankfurt School. This is very, very important. And this, in fact, provides one of, in fact, a number of clues to the kind of, say, concepts which he developed later. That is, what exactly is meant by his negotiation with Frankfurt School. Now, generally, it is argued, or it is commonly known, that Habermas, the second generation Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School, as many of you perhaps know, it was formed in the year 1923 in the city of Frankfurt. I'm not going into the discussion of how Frankfurt School developed, etc., etc. But there was an early Frankfurt School, the first generation Frankfurt School writers, and some of the most important figures of this first generation Frankfurt School thinkers or writers were Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and many others. Now, this early generation of Frankfurt School writers, they actually had to leave Germany, were rather forced to leave Germany after Hitler came to power in 1933. So Frankfurt School virtually had to wind up after 1933. They all settled down in the United States. And eventually, after the end of the war, then when everything settled down, peace was restored, and Germany gradually began to rise from the ashes, destruction of the war. So in that situation, that is after the end of the war, by the beginning of the 50s, the Frankfurt School writers, Adorno, Horkheimer, they, and many of their colleagues, not all of them, but many of their colleagues, they gradually now began to return to Germany. They returned to Germany, and Frankfurt School now entered its second phase. In the early 50s, Jürgen Habermas, he actually was one of the leading figures in the second phase of the Frankfurt School. And when Habermas was quite young, started his career to the second generation Frankfurt School as an assistant of the great Frankfurt School philosopher Theodor Adorno. As an assistant of Adorno, he started his career. Now, as I was saying, what is Habermas's relationship, is negotiation with the Frankfurt School? To put it very briefly, Habermas's negotiation with the Frankfurt School was twofold. The early generation Frankfurt School writers, when they came back to Germany, most of them had settled down in the United States when they came back. In fact, even before their even before they came back to Germany, when they were in the United States, well, they had come out with a kind of understanding which tried to argue that European Enlightenment, with its focus on human reason, the triumph of reason, with its focus on the importance of reason, well, that is over. That is, the age of reason has come to an end. The war, concentration camp, Holocaust, genocide, that is, all the horrible acts of war, these more or less have established the point that civilization has reached its dead end. Our future is bleak. Reason has lost its potentiality. Reason is dead. We are living in an age of unreason. Because otherwise, how can you explain the triumph of fascism in Germany? How can you explain the Holocaust? How can you explain the war? How can you explain the barbarities caused by the war? This cannot be explained by reason. And so, reason has no future. It was a very dark, pessimistic understanding of the future. And they picked up an expression. I will come back to that point a little later. That is, reason was used by those who waged the war, by those who actually established fascist rule, not only in Germany, not only in Italy, but almost the whole of Europe. Now, these were people who used reason, who used science, who used technology, scientific reasoning. They used all these things with one purpose: as an instrument of domination, as an instrument of control. Domination of whom? Used instrument. I'm sorry, they used reason as an instrument to dominate others, to dominate the Jews, to control the helpless, to perpetuate a rule of terror and violence. Reason, science, they were used as instruments to run gas chambers and concentration camps. So, Frankfurt School writers like Horkheimer, like Adorno, in fact, end of the war, they came out with a very famous book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. In that book also, they came out with this understanding. And they used an expression, instrumental reason, an instrument used for domination and control of others, for domination of nature, beings, for domination of the world. They therefore said that we have no other alternative. That is, the future that lies before us is bleak, uncertain, and dark. Adorno, however, put forward an alternative. That alternative was, and Habermas, I'm sorry, Theodore Adorno was in a way, he had inclination for this kind of thing. That is, he said that the only way out of it is, the only alternative notion of violence, terror, and then, of course, the kind of dark age that lies before us is resort to art, aesthetics, music. Adorno, in fact, also had a great expertise in European music. And he said that music, art, They are our only resource. They are our only alternative. Now, why I'm saying all these things? Because Habermas actually had to negotiate this question, this problem. As I said, he had a twofold negotiation in regard to Frankfurt School. In the first place, or at one level, Habermas pointed out that yes, some of the ideas, some of the points which Frankfurt School is raising, some of the points raised by, say, Horkheimer or Adorno regarding the reason. Yes, I agree with some of the points, but I do not agree with all of them. That is his first point. That yes, that is European Enlightenment, European notion of reason, the Enlightenment notion of reason. They have created serious problems, but I cannot rule out absolutely, in absolute terms, the possibility, the potentiality of reason. Reason has got to stay. This is his first point. His second point is, he believes, he argues, and that point I will explain later. He says that it is possible to construct an alternative world, to envision an alternative understanding of the world based on reason. So reason, in fact, is the clue which will help us to build up a new world. Pessimistic notion of the world, this very dark vision of the future, which was put forward by the early Frankfurt School, the first generation Frankfurt School writers, this was not shared by Habermas. Habermas clearly and categorically suggests that no, I think the future is not that dark, future is not that bleak. How? I will explain it later. So that is my second point regarding this background. And the third point, and this is the last point relating to his background. Now this is very, very interesting. Habermas, when he was engaged in, say, in his activities, in his work, in the second phase of the Frankfurt School, I'm talking of the, say, early mid-50s. Habermas, in some of his interviews, has stated it very categorically that at that time I had very limited knowledge, very limited understanding of the intellectual world around me, in the sense that I had, of course, a training in our German philosophy. I had read Kant, I had read Hegel, and of course I had read Marx. I had a deep admiration, great admiration for Marx. I had already written, I had already read, in fact, Lukács's very famous work, History and Class Consciousness. Very, very difficult work, but I had read it and I developed a great admiration for Lukács. But that was more or less my, say, my horizon, so far as the world of intellect is concerned. But then he says that since the late 50s and beginning of the 60s, I began to encounter, and Habermas says that this was very, very useful for me. That is, I began to encounter a number of trends, a number of traditions, a number of ideas which were non-German. Non-German sources, non-German traditions, non-German streams of thought. Now, what is meant by that? He says, I began to develop familiarity, analytical tradition, American pragmatism, then a number of, say, trends, a number of, say, currents, which on pluralism, democracy, systems analysis, all sorts of things. The notion of pragmatism. That is, I gradually began to immerse myself in non-German traditions, and I began to pick up very interesting and relevant clues from these traditions. And they later, Habermas says, helped me a lot in the sense, as I began to think that I have to build up an alternative future. That is, if I have to build up an alternative understanding of the future, which will be different from the kind of dark, pessimistic understanding shared by the early Frankfurt School writers, then I cannot confine myself to the German tradition. German tradition, yes, has given me many resources, has given me many interesting clues. But German philosophy, German tradition has reached its limit. I have to pick up clues from other traditions. Habermas is quite un-German, because this is something which we do not normally come across German writers. Germans are very, very proud of their own tradition, their own intellect, their own culture, and they are rather conservative, I would say. So far as this sort of approach is concerned. But Habermas says that I found it quite easy to move to these other areas, British, American. In fact, he says that the great American sociologist Calcutta persons. So I accepted many of his ideas. I accepted many of the ideas of American pragmatism, John Dewey, William James. So Habermas's idea is this, and that is the third and last point relating to the background. That is, Habermas is trying to appropriate. Habermas is trying to fuse German tradition and the non-German tradition. Many of the ideas which were there latent, deeply embedded in the German tradition, and again many of the ideas which are absolutely non-German or un-German. So, with these ideas, with this, I now, with this discussion of the background, I now move into the second part, and that is the most crucial thing. That is some of the key concepts developed by Habermas. And what we come across is very interesting. That is, these concepts, in a way, are interrelated, and these concepts, in a way, are closely related to the kind of background that I have already explained rather briefly. Now, so far as the key concepts of Habermas are concerned, we have to keep in mind one thing. Habermas, right from the very beginning, in fact, Habermas has not made it very clear, but if one looks at Habermas's ideas and tries to understand Habermas rather systematically, then one finds that perhaps, I'm using the word perhaps, it's a conjecture, it's a guesswork. Habermas, perhaps right from the very beginning, knowingly or unknowingly, he had an agenda before him. What was that agenda? That point I have already briefly focused on in the background. That is, Habermas is obsessed with the idea of an alternative future. He tries to develop a blueprint for a new society. That is his agenda. And in order to work out this agenda, Habermas is developing some concepts. I again say that Habermas has made it very clear. But the way he has developed it, if we look into his early writings, and if we look into his, say, more mature later writings, there is a kind of, say, running theme which somehow perhaps unites his writings. I'm not saying all his writings, but many of his writings. Now, let me begin with one of his earliest works. That was a work entitled publish. I'm sorry, no, not yes. It was published, but it has a very interesting story. I will go into it right now. The name of the work is "The Structural Transformation in the Year 1962." Now, this curious history in the sense, of course, it was written in German. Now, this work actually was Habermas's, I would say, first level PhD thesis. Actually, in Germany, the standard practice is that you have to write two theses. One at the first level, the other at the the first level PhD thesis. If it is write the second thesis, and then it will be awarded. Habermas says this work, the structural transformation of the public sphere, it was written in 1962 when he was quite young at that time. He was in his 30s. It was written under the guidance of Theodore Adorno, because I have already said that he actually was working as an assistant of Adorno. Adorno was a very influential figure. And now, this work he had written and submitted as his PhD, first level PhD thesis. But you'll be surprised to know it was not accepted. Habermas's work, Structural Transformation of Public Sphere, it was not accepted. But what is more interesting is, we, the English-speaking public, we came to know about this book only in the year 1989, after 27 years. We did not know about this book. So, Habermas's very important work, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, it was translated into English. I don't know why it took so much time. It came to us in the year 1989, after 27 years. Meanwhile, what had happened, and I think that created a lot of difficulties, problems, complications in regard to the understanding of Habermas. That is, meanwhile, that is during these 2 decades, a number of writings of Habermas which had been published much later, they were translated into English. To know late Habermas first and young Habermas much later. So if we keep this background in mind, then I think it will also become clear to us that why this notion of public sphere, which has become a very important concept in social science. If you look at the genealogy of this concept, this Habermasian concept of public sphere, you will find that discussion centering around this concept. Well, these discussions started taking place only since the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. Because Habermas's book was published, we for the first time came to know about Habermas's use of the concept of public sphere after this book was published. So, without going into further details of the book, let me briefly explain what Habermas tried to, or what Habermas had in mind while referring to the concept of, while developing the concept of public sphere. There are, to put it very briefly, there are two underlying dimensions. One is how this concept developed, when this concept developed, and what is meant by this concept. And the second thing is what happened to this concept. Now, first of all, public sphere. Public sphere by public sphere, Habermas means a kind of culture which is very much European. It developed, say, around 18th century. It became a hallmark, characteristic of European cultural life, especially in France. So what is meant by that? And this idea, actually, Habermas said, discussion concerning public life, concerning problems of public life, which will help improve the ambience of public life. So this is actually product of enlightenment, European enlightenment. And through this participation in the public sphere, in fact, public life is enlightened. And thereby it expands the horizon of democracy. It enlightens the public, enlightens the society, it enlightens all who are engaged in this conversation. That is the basic meaning of public sphere. So it is not at all a kind of conversation which deals with, say, your mundane problems, your petty private problems. No. That is what kind of problems you are facing, say, while purchasing things from the market, while, say, cooking, whether you have come across some problem, whether you have a problem with your neighbor, whether you have problem in your family, whether you have problem with your children, this is not the kind of problem Habermas has. That is, Habermas says that it is a very conscious, rational deliberation. So this is, as I said, it's a two dimension. This is one dimension. The other dimension is, and that is very, very crucial. Habermas says that yes, this was the characteristic of European Enlightenment. This, in fact, Enlightenment gave birth to the notion of public sphere and thereby Enlightenment gave birth to a kind of enlightened society. But what is happening now? Habermas is, say, talking about post-war Europe. Habermas is writing this book in the year 1962, early 60s. The Second World War had come to an end in 1945. So even 2 decades were not over. So what was Habermas's experience? He says, and that is the second point regarding public sphere, that is, public sphere, it had great possibility, it had great potentiality, and it opened up a new horizon. But what we witness now is a decline of the public sphere. Public sphere, the very idea or the very meaning of public sphere, it is collapsing. Why it is collapsing? Who is contributing to this collapse? Modern capitalism. Commercialization, vulgarization of our society. And he says, for that, who is to blame? European modernity. But here again, Habermas has a word of caution. When he says European modernity, not that European modernity as a concept is contributing to it. No. European modernity as distorted under capitalism. It is capitalist, bourgeois modernity with its lust for profit, with its focus on commercialization. It has actually vandalized our culture, vandalized our society. And that has contributed to the erosion, degeneration of public sphere. Therefore, we have to get out of it. So, public sphere has had a great potentiality, had great possibility, but that possibility is being distorted. The very notion of public sphere, it is in a way, it has suffered a lot, and so we have to think in terms of an alternative blueprint. So see, this notion of alternative, it is there. That is, Habermas is guided by the fact that the notion of public sphere based on Enlightenment reason, well, that somehow has lost its meaning. So we have to restore the meaning of the public sphere. So, decline and restoration. This is the twofold agenda or the twofold understanding of public sphere, so far as Habermas is concerned. Now, next point. That is how, as I said, Habermas is, so this is one of his key concept of public sphere. Now the point is how Habermas is thinking in terms of an alternative project, alternative society. So, as I said, his agenda was to build up a blueprint. So, Habermas, and as I said, this is a running theme in all his writings. So, Habermas, we have to now look at how Habermas works it out. For that, we have to look at another work. That work came out, the monumental work of Habermas. It came out in 2 volumes, published in the year 1984, The Theory of Communicative Action. volume 1 and volume 2. I'm just for the time being mentioning this book, but I will come back to it. In fact, there is a link between the theory of communicative action and the structural transformation of public sphere. How I will explain. Now, in order to understand how Habermas builds up his alternative understanding of society, how Habermas places before us an alternative blueprint of future society, which, as we will see, is quite controversial. It raises a number of complicated questions. But let us first see how Habermas works it out. Habermas starts off with a very sophisticated theoretical understanding. In order to understand this theoretical understanding, one has to, in fact, look at some of the clues, but I will not, because that will take time and that may sound a bit complicated to many. So I will avoid that part. I will simply focus on how Habermas does it, instead of how Habermas draws some of the clues from other sources. Habermas says that if we look at ourselves as human beings, as human subjects, then what we find is that our ideas, our thoughts, these are expressed through language. Language expresses our thoughts. And our thoughts are actually shaped by what Habermas describes as the life world. Life world actually derived from this is a translation of the typical German expression Lebenswelt, that is life world. Leben is life, Welt is world. Lebenswelt. Now, what is meant by this life? Life world is the world which shapes us, which we experience, which we feel. That way, life world is very authentic. It shapes us. It gives us identity. It constructs us. It builds us. Now, Habermas argues that so far as this life world is concerned, through life world in fact shapes our language. We are born in this life world. We grow up in this life world. And thereby our language also, in a way, is a reflection of this life world. In fact, to some extent, perhaps it can be said that life world is, the meaning of the life world is mediated to us through language. Through language, we can express our feelings, our our association with the life. So that is one aspect. But then Habermas says, and he will now be able to relate this point to the issue which I have just discussed in this structural transformation of others. He says, but this life world is under threat. Is under threat. Is under threat in the sense, he says, he uses an expression, colonization of the life world. What is meant by that, colonization of the life world? This life world is continuously interacting with science and technology. The world of modernity, which has been created by modern European science. So European science, European technology, they have given birth to modernity. And our life world our very sense of being, which is embedded in the life, it is always engaged in a kind of tension with the claims of modernity. Now, what is exactly meant by that? Technology, a technology-driven world, a science-driven world, a world driven by the values of modern European modernity, which is capitalist modernity. It is trying to control the life. It is trying to establish its impact on the life. It is trying to win over the life. It is trying to dominate the life world. So our life world, which is our very own, it is being claimed by modernity, by capitalism. So there is a continuous tension. And what is happening as a result? As a result, what is happening is that we are not able, and here again I go back to the basic idea of structural transformation of the public state. We are not able really to be engaged in a real communication with each other. My identity is getting distorted. Your identity is getting distorted because of the threat of this colonization. I am being claimed by capitalist modernity. You are also being claimed by capitalist modernity. So when we are engaged in conversation, it is not a distortion-free conversation. It is a manipulated conversation. Our very identity, our very existence, it is getting distorted under the impact of this technology, capitalist model. Therefore, what we require is, number one, we have to get out of this stranglehold. And we have to think in terms of a setup where you have a distortion-free communication. So communication, negotiation, engagement, that becomes Habermas's dominating theme. That is, we have to go back to my life world. We have to get back what is lost. We have to get back what is colonized. But here is a word of caution. When Habermas is talking about these problems of European modernity, he is not saying that modernity as such is to be dismissed. Not at all. He says that modernity, after all, was a product of European enlightenment. Modernity was based on reason. But this very meaning of reason got distorted under capitalism. So capitalism distorted the very spirit of modernity. And that, in fact, this led to a very famous debate in the early 1980s between the great French philosopher, post-structuralist philosopher, François Lyotard, and Habermas, basically on this question. Lyotard's whole argument was that the very notion of enlightenment, the very notion of reason, the very notion of modernity, well, this has got to be dismissed. Because, as Habermas is saying, yes, it has led to domination, control, distortion, vulgarization. And there is a kind of striking similarity between the ideas of the first generation Frankfurt School and the post-structuralist writers. In fact, just a moment of digression. Foucault, in one of his interviews, stated that when we were developing our ideas of postmodernism, post-structuralism, our understanding of enlightenment, our dismissive attitude towards enlightenment, our arguments against European modernity, we were not aware of the contributions of the Frankfurt School. Had we known the Frankfurt School in depth at that time, we had just heard about Frankfurt School, but we had not studied the Frankfurt School in depth. So had we known Frankfurt School earlier, perhaps we could have established a very close nexus between Frankfurt School arguments and our arguments, in the sense that Frankfurt School has a dismissive attitude towards European reason, modernity, enlightenment. We also have the same understanding. Now, Habermas does not share this understanding. This we have to keep in mind. Habermas is saying that we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Enlightenment, there is nothing wrong with enlightenment as such. There is nothing wrong with modernity as such. But how modernity got distorted, that is the important. It is capitalism which has distorted. It is capitalism which has vulgarized modernity. That is the most important. Therefore, Habermas makes a distinction between Habermas therefore makes a distinction between modernity, the spirit of modernity, and the way modernity has been vulgarized, vandalized, distorted by capitalism. So this point we have to keep in mind. So we now come to the next point, that is, we have to therefore think in terms of a society which of course will be guided by the spirit of modernity, which of course will be guided by the spirit of science, but it has to be a society where individuals will be able to be engaged in a free, rational communication. And he says, if distortion-free communication can be ensured, if distortion-free communication, that is, if we can establish a kind of order which will be ruled by, which will be dominated by distortion-free communication, that will be the triumph of democracy. And therefore, what is most important is we have to establish a kind of situation where intersubjective communication, that will be guaranteed. And you can understand the clues lie in his first work, the structural transformation of the public sphere. This was the understanding of public sphere. That is, you are engaged. This, he says, this was the understanding of ancient Greece. You are engaged in free, distortion-free, rational communication. And that gave ancient Greece actually, or that empowered ancient Greece with the spirit of democracy. So if you have to ensure the rule of democracy, then you have to go in for this kind of distortion-free communication. Now, initially, when I was discussing the second part, I just referred to a book. I said I will come back to this point later. That is the theory of communicative action. Volumes 1 and 2 in the year 1984 is a monumental work. Now, here actually, Habermas develops this notion of communication in much more elaborate. But before I take up this point, which primarily occurs, I've forgotten the exact chapter, but in part 2 of this, this point is elaborated. But before in fact, there are several other things associated with this, not necessarily developed in this book, but in some other one. But before I come to this point, let me explain one point. That is, I have already told you, in fact, I mentioned this expression. That is, the early Frankfurt School writers, with whom Habermas had a kind of, say, blow hot and cold sort of relationship. To some extent, I accept their notion. At another level, I do not accept their notion. There's a kind of dialectical understanding. Partly agree, partly I do not agree. Now there, I used an expression, very well-known expression used by the Frankfurt School writers, the instrumental reason. Reason used to dominate, oppress, repress, control others. As against instrumental reason, what Habermas has in mind is a notion of what may be described as communicative reason. Through reason, I communicate. Through rational communication, we actually ensure intersubjectivity. This is actually associated with a school of thought. But again, I will not go into this because this will take time and this will make things more complicated, especially for the students. That is, it is a notion derived from a philosophical school known as hermeneutics, the hermeneutic understanding, this intersubjectivity, etc. etc. Anyway, I'm not going into that. Habermas, so far as this particular expression is concerned, that is communicative reason, say the notion of intersubjectivity, he actually derived all these ideas. I will very briefly touch upon it in a moment. He actually derived all these ideas from traditional German philosophy, to a large extent from Immanuel Kant, for example, to some extent from Max Weber. Now, how these things impacted Habermas, I will not go into that because, again, I must warn myself that will take a lot of time, so I will not go into that. But what I would like to highlight at this point is, in part 2 of this 2-volume work, Habermas has, and this notion, Habermas does not make it very clear, but there is a hint in some of his interviews that Habermas is using the concept action. Habermas, to a large extent, was influenced by the American sociologist Calcutta. And there is a kind of, say, implicit understanding in Habermas that he perhaps picked up this notion from Calcutta. Anyway, what is that notion? He says there can be, so far as establishing distortion-free communication is concerned, there can be 2 types of action. One is strategic action, and the other kind of action he calls communicative action. He makes a distinction between the two: strategic action and communicative action. Now, what is strategic action? Strategic action is goal specific, goal oriented. I want to do it. I want to do it. I want to attain this specific goal. In order to achieve that goal, in order to accomplish that objective, I pursue a line of action. So a communication is established, definitely, between my intention and my goal through a strategy. This is called strategic, but its purpose is very much limited. It is goal specific, it is goal oriented. Habermas says that there is another kind of action, which is called communicative action, where you, in your activities, in your actions, you are not guided by any such specific selfish goal. You are guided by what? You are guided by a larger perspective. What is that larger perspective? You simply are engaged in a fruitful, vibrant communication, which will expand the horizon of your life, which will enrich, which will enlighten the society. So we, the individuals, we have to be engaged in, and we have to try, we have to strive for that. That is to be engaged in a proper communicative action. And Habermas says, at least this is the implied understanding, this will actually create a kind of society which will not be ruled by vulgarization of modernity, which will not be ruled by distortion-free communication. Rather, it will be a kind of realization of the spirit of enlightenment. In fact, Habermas, when he was engaged in his conversation, in his debate with Lyotard, Habermas, there's a very famous phrase of Habermas, that is, unfinished project of modernity. European enlightenment gave birth to a kind of modernity, the dream of which remained unfinished, unrealized, because it got vandalized and vulgarized through capitalism. And therefore, the spirit of modernity, guided by reason, well, it has got to be worked on. And he believes it is possible. Now, if you look at this understanding, this blueprint, alternative blueprint of Habermas, then I think you can guess that Habermas has got a very strong, it's almost a kind of faith that yes, it is possible for human beings to be engaged in a true, proper, rational communication. True, proper, rational, intersubjective dialogue. This dialogue is possible. And if this dialogue is possible, there will be no war. There will be no violence. There will be no concentration camp. There will be no Holocaust. So that future is open for us. And we have to create the ground for distortion-free communication. Habermas was once asked a question, very interesting question. In fact, Habermas was asked this question because in course of his responses, he used a concept. This is another concept. These are all quite difficult concepts, but anyway, we have to it is not possible for me to elaborate all these concepts, but to have an idea of what they are all about. At least if you get the gist of this concept, that will be more than enough. Anyway, Habermas was asked a question that you have used a concept. It is called discourse ethics. What is meant by that? Habermas elaborated. And if we take a quick look at how he elaborated it, then we can link this concept to this concept of distortion-free communication. Habermas says that by discourse ethics, what I mean is this. Imagine a situation. Why imagine? It is happening all the while in the world today, in our own country very much. That is, certain acts of injustice have been committed. Now, against these acts of injustice, the entire society mobilizes itself against these acts of injustice. How the society mobilizes itself? The society mobilizes itself in defense of justice, guided by the understanding that what has happened is irrational. What is happening is an act of unreason. An act of injustice is an act of unreason. It is something immoral. It is unjust. It is immoral, it is unjust, it is irrational. It is possible if a society mobilizes itself. What does it establish? What does it prove? It establishes that yes, it is possible for human beings to be guided by reason, to establish a communication network among themselves, and to come out in the streets with the slogan that we want justice. So how is it possible? He says it is possible because we are guided by the act of reason, the spirit of reason, and we are able to establish a kind of communication. All of us feel that we should come out in the streets with placards, with slogans, and we demand the act of injustice. It must be prevented. Such acts of injustice must be prevented in future. And those who have committed these acts of injustice, they have to be given exemplary punishment. Now, how is it possible? It is possible because all of us, therefore, are guided by an act of reason, by the spirit of reason. And all of us are able to establish a kind of communication network. This, Habermas actually, in this understanding, Habermas is deeply guided on this notion of categorical imperative, that all of us feel that we are driven by a moral consideration. Therein comes in the notion of moral autonomy. That is another dimension of Habermas' thought. I'm not going into that. Anyway, so this more or less sums up Habermas's world. Habermas's, I think if I sum it up, it means Habermas critiques distortion-free communication, which is the result of vulgarization of morality. How he is extremely worried about colonization of the life world. how he feels that our uh, uh, that is how instrumentalist reason has to be replaced by communicative reason, how an alternative blueprint of the future can be created. And he believes very strongly that yes, human beings are essentially rational beings. They are guided by the notion of reason. And if the screen of distortion, if that screen can be removed, then real distortion-free communication can be established. We'll be guided by reason, and that means the restoration of the public sphere. That can be possible. So this basically is the world of, or I should not use the word, the gist of the political philosophy of Habermas. I now take up very briefly. This was the most difficult part. Manisha, can you just tell me how much time I have?
So you can take your time.
No, I can take my time, but still say for another 15-20 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I now take up the third part, that is reconstruction of Marxism. Marxism, as I said, I've already given you the hint. Habermas initially was greatly fascinated by Marx, especially young Marx's writings on alienation, freedom, etc. But later I have said Habermas in fact changed his understanding. There was a shift in his understanding. Now, what explains his change? There are two very, very interesting observations of Habermas. One observation, that is his second observation, you will be able at once to connect with what has already been stated. That is his notion of intersubjectivity, communicative reasoning, etc. Let me first of all take up the first. It's a kind of argument which may apparently sound quite odd, but anyway, this is Habermas's understanding. He says, as I said, he says that there are two problems with Marx. One, he says, and that is the, I think, the more important aspect. Habermas says that if we look at Marx's writing, Marx's understanding, then what we come across is Marx has his focus on subject, just as Hegel had his focus also on the subject. How the subject realizes itself. In how the subject realizes itself in the actualization of the objective. For Marx, it is the proletariat. It is the working class. How the working class realizes its own potentiality through the making of history. This is Marx's understanding. And Habermas says, therein lies a very serious problem, which perhaps Marx could not anticipate. What was that problem? Habermas argues, the problem is, how does, according to Marx, the subject, the proletariat, realize its dream? How the subject creates an objective world, that is the world of socialism and communism, in which the subject feels that ultimately its dream will be realized. How it will be possible? By using reason. The proletariat, by using its power of reason, achieves a world, achieves a goal where the objective world becomes identified with the subject. The objective world is created by the subject by using its power of reason. Habermas says, theoretically, it's quite a challenging proposition. Yes, if the proletariat as a subject can realize its dream by using its power of reason, then obviously that would be a great achievement. But Habermas now says, if the opposite happens, if the subject collapses, what will happen? If the subject collapses, then reason also collapses. And then what will happen? There is no future. I again land myself up into that world of darkness. Reason has collapsed. That is going back to the understanding of the early Frankfurt School writers. Reason has collapsed. Subject is dead. And Habermas says, yes, it has happened. You look at what happened after 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, East European socialism collapsed. The world just was turned upside down. So the dream of socialism, the dream of communism, it is dead. So Habermas argues that this was the main problem of Marx. That is, his emphasis on the subject, his conviction that the subject will ultimately triumph with the power of reason. Marx could not anticipate that the subject may also collapse. And with the collapse of the subject, the reason may also collapse. The proletariat's power of reasoning will collapse. This is one problem. The other problem, and that, as I said, this, the clue you can directly pick up from what has been discussed earlier. He says that in Marx's whole scheme of things, the way Marx has developed his ideas, Habermas argues the problem is Marx is talking of class struggle, class conflict. Ultimately, it will be the victory of the proletariat, the victory of the subject. Now, if you say that the victory of the subject, victory of the proletariat, well, that is the ultimate goal. That means there will be only one subject, one class. Habermas argues Marx does not consider the possibility of any communication between classes, any kind of intersubjectivity. There will be only one subject, no interaction. And if that subject collapses, everything collapses. So that was the second problem of Marx. And so Habermas says, understand, Marxism, the way Marx framed it, the way Marxists have framed it, where you have no scope for engagement, discussion, negotiation, dialogue, intersubjectivity, intersubjective communication. You have only one thing, reasoning, that is the power of reasoning as shared by the proletariat. And history has proved that it is all wrong. Therefore, we cannot accept Marx in the way we have interpreted it. So, I think it is now possible for us to understand the shift in Habermas's writing. In the earlier writings of Habermas, it was not like that. Habermas was great. Now, I'm not saying, and Habermas himself also stated, and let there be no misunderstanding on this question. Habermas is never saying that he has turned against Marx, because he has turned against Marx. No. He says, I am greatly indebted to Marx. Marx, after all, belongs to the Enlightenment tradition. Marx belongs to the great tradition of German philosophy. And Habermas says, I have great respect for Marx. And he says, in my early days, when I grew up, yes, I was deeply influenced by Marx's writing. But that does not mean that all that Marx has said is necessarily sacrosanct. And finally, I will now wind up my lecture by focusing on the last point. That is, this I will do very briefly. That is, some of the responses which Habermas's theory, Habermas's political philosophy has evoked. What are the responses? There are many, but I will pick up just 4 main responses to Habermas. And we have to keep in mind that Habermas says all these ideas. Well, these ideas have been seriously critiqued, very seriously questioned from different angles, different views. The first question is that when Habermas almost idealizes the notion of public sphere, who constitutes this public? That is the most important question. When Habermas talks about this potential of reason shared by all, then those who are critics, they argue that yes, it can be true, it can be relevant for people who are really enlightened. But what about people who are not that much enlightened? Who have a different understanding of society, who do not share this notion of reason? What happens to them? Habermas's notion of public sphere, guided by the spirit of, say, enlightened reasoning, shared by rational public, it is argued by the critics that it is a very strong elitist understanding. It does not take into account those who are not educated, who are not cultured, who are deprived. Habermas is not, of course, advocating any elitist understanding, but this is implied in his understanding. It just leaves out a large section of society. Second, Nancy Fraser and many scholars who are feminists, they have argued that what has been our experience? The so-called public sphere, it has been largely dominated by men, by educated culture, in fact in Europe also, when Habermas is idealizing 18th century Europe. What was the status of women in 18th century? It was dominated, yes, it was cultured, no doubt. It has a great cultural ambience, there is no doubt about it. But the problem is, what about women? How many women were educated? How many women had real access to this public sphere. In fact, it is a male-dominated patriarchal society. In that society, unless you take into account, unless you recognize the unique autonomous identity of women, can we really do justice to a male-dominated public sphere? That is the second problem. The third problem is that Habermas's notion, in fact, many of his later writings, is quite evident. And I personally will not blame Habermas for that. It's quite natural, it's very normal. Habermas's entire understanding is, number one, Eurocentric, and number two, it is utopian. Many critics argue that this whole notion of enlightened understanding picked up from ancient Greece, idealizing 18th century Europe, and then dreaming of a society, dreaming of a future, thinking in terms of a blueprint where all people are guided by reason. And this is a very typical Eurocentric European understanding, enlightened European understanding. And the whole, that is, all these ideas are rooted in the spirit of European enlightenment. So it's very strong Eurocentric bias. And people argue that you can imagine this kind of look. But say, can you just use this framework to a society like India? That we can think in terms of a society of the future, where all of us, in fact, when we talk of India, can think in terms of a homogeneous India. We have to consider the notion of identity politics, micro-level identities. Habermas is a very straight-jacket, homogenized kind of understanding. And that actually leads to his European vision. In fact, very interesting, Habermas, I have forgotten the exact time. Habermas was once asked this question, that what is your idea of utopia building? He was not directly asked this question, that your ideas also are to a large extent utopia. But Habermas's answer was quite clear. He says, yes, I believe that that utopian ideas, they also have a great role to play in history. And unless you dream, unless you imagine, unless you build up utopias, how can you think in terms of a prospective, futuristic vision? So that way, perhaps he was right. But the point is that if you link up these two notions, that it's a utopia built up in a Eurocentric perspective, how does it apply? How is it relevant for non-European society? That's a very, very serious point. Just imagine that if somebody says, we Indians, we are all guided by a notion of reason, so there should not be any act of injustice in our society. If somebody says, as Habermas is saying, yes, that's wonderful. That is this notion of discourse ethics. If all Indians today can wake up and all Indians are guided by this understanding, that let there be no more any act of injustice. We are guided by this notion that we are, that is a kind of, say, Kantian categorical imperative, that from tomorrow we will be all guided by a sense of justice, by a sense of morality. There will be no injustice. There will be no unjust act. But is it possible? Why India? What is happening all over the world? How can you then explain the triumph of the conservative rightist forces? What is happening now in Afghanistan? How, what we don't know what will happen in the next few days. So how does it fit in? How does Habermasian framework fit in with this reality? So this is my third. And fourth and last point, his notion, his reconstruction of Marxism, especially his second point, that yes, there can be, of course, dialogue, and I think, and many Marxists have pointed out that Marxists do not have any objection regarding dialogue. There can be, of course, a dialogue, and there are dialogues between the, say, those who are owners and those who are laborers. Yes, there can be a dialogue between those who own a property and those who are propertyless, between the capitalist and the worker. There can be a dialogue. There is no problem, and thereby there can be a communication. But if you just rule notion of exploitation, justice, involved in the relationship between capital and labor, which is the crux of Marxist understanding. Marx never said that there can be no negotiation, there can be no dialogue between capital and labor. Marx never said that. But dialogue between capital and labor is one thing. And the understanding of the relationship of between capital and labor, whether it is a relation of exploitation or not, whether it's involved in it or not. And if that be so, then rule of capital must go and the rule of labor must run. How it will happen? That's a different story. Just because in 1991 Soviet Union collapsed, that means that everything has collapsed. Well, that perhaps is a far-fetched conclusion. Anyway, these are some of the points. These are I said that it will be a 4-step understanding. In 4 phases, I will before you. I have tried to do it in my own way. I do not know whether I could communicate in that Habermas's understanding of to all of you. Here I should stop. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, sir. Without a doubt, a very riveting and very informative lecture, and probably you made Habermas sound so simple that I'm short of words. It's been amazing listening to you, and I've been copiously taking down, your notes. Questions also, sir. Can we take a few of them with your permission?
In fact, I'm just looking at the chat box. Some questions have come.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So can I ask them to just unmute and ask those questions? If it is
yes. Please.
Sana Farid, are you there? You wanted to raise something?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you just hold on for a minute?
No, this is Shiva. Can I ask?
Sana Farid. She was the first to ask.
Yes.
Raise her hand. Yeah.
Okay.
Sana?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for lecture. For Habermas, public sphere is something which allows one to have discourse and dialogue on general interest and also to resolve the differences of opinion. So, looking at the contemporary public spaces in Indian society, for instance, the idea of surveillance, and sir, how far we can relate to Habermas in Indian society, and what is the role of religion in public sphere here? One more question, sir. Can we look at the idea of life world, as you mentioned, the idea of life world from the communicative action theory of Habermas? How far? Can we look at the idea of life world of Habermas from the lens of Gandhian philosophy? Thank you, sir.
So can we take all the questions, or do you want?
Yes. I think that would
Because there are quite a few questions. So, Samrita Sinha, would you like to ask your question? Shaivi?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I think my question was already answered by sir in the last part. So, as a critique to Habermas's philosophy, so I guess it will not make sense to ask it again.
Okay. Sundar?
Yes, ma'am. Sir, I wanted to know about the mediating agency or governmental structure that regulates communicative reason in the public sphere. And another thing I wanted to know, does the overdetermination of the public discourse by reason erode the individual autonomy and subjective aesthetic stances? You mentioned the Habermas's critique of Lyotard. Can you elaborate a bit on that? I want to know about Habermas's position on the postmodernists, especially his take on their aesthetic stances. Thank you, sir.
Okay. And Shweta Dahiya, you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. So my question is like the idea of this public sphere, it has been almost non-existent in Indian society. And suddenly with the coming of social media, there's sudden emergence of the public sphere. People are suddenly interacting and communicating. So, is it even distortion-free communication in a country like ours, which had no tradition of public sphere?
Okay. Any other question? Shiva, you wanted to ask a question. I see your hand raised. You want to ask your question? Shiva?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sir. So yes, ma'am. Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes.
Sir, my question is, are utopia and public sphere are same? Or since I'm doing my PhD studies on Dalit studies, should I apply to Dalits? What way I will look at it? That's my question, sir.
I think
Thank you,
those are the preliminary questions, sir.
Okay.
And,
Yes. I'm not taking up questions one by one, rather the issues.
Yes.
Issues. I think that will be easier. Otherwise, longer time. In the first place, I think we should be careful about one thing. This is my personal approach. Not only in regard to Habermas, but to any European author, European writer, whether it is Aristotle or Hegel or Marx or Habermas. That is, we have a tendency to just give too much importance to the concepts, the theories developed by a European writer, Western scholar, and somehow try to explore whether it can be applied to our country. My point is why I should necessarily try to apply, as the last speaker is saying, Dalit studies, why I should situate it necessarily in a Habermasian frame. I think we should not try to situate Indian realities necessarily in a European framework. European scholars, when they are working out their problems, they are least bothered about this question, whether they will situate their problem in a non-Western framework. I would be much more interested in understanding whether European writers, they are concerned, or in what way they are concerned about the non-European world. That would be much more relevant. Habermas's understanding I'm not showing any disrespect to Habermas. What I'm saying is, and that was made quite unambiguously clear, that Habermas's whole understanding, that is essentially Eurocentric. It was bound to be Eurocentric. For that, you need not blame Habermas. His training, his orientation, his background, everything. What we can do is, we can take up certain clues and you can take up certain ideas, that's all. But don't say that you have to necessarily situate Indian reality in Habermasian framework or Aristotelian framework, not like that. I will give you just one example. In recent period, there have been many writings of Marx. I'm referring to Marx for one reason. For quite some time, it has been a kind of, it has been almost many Indian writers, for many Indian left-wing scholars, to argue that Marx was essentially Eurocentric. Marx did not bother about non-European. Marx did not understand non-European. The whole thing is just not true. There are now a number of writings of Marx which are available. There is a very famous book written by Kevin Anderson, Marx and the non-European world or non-Western world, where he has shown how Marx shifted his attention to non-European society in the later part of his life. So it is like this. Rosa Luxemburg, for example, we do not know and we do not bother about this. How Rosa Luxemburg became so deeply involved and interested in the non-European world. We hardly discuss this. So that is my approach to all this question. Regarding this question, Habermas and postmodernism, this Lyotard debate. Yes, actually, this I have forgotten the exact particular. Habermas, actually, it happened like this. Habermas was given, I think that was in 1981. Habermas was awarded in Frankfurt, in the city of Frankfurt in Germany, the Theodor Adorno Prize for his achievement. And on the occasion of this award-giving ceremony, Habermas delivered a lecture, very strongly, say, rebutting postmodernism. In fact, Habermas said that, Habermas used an expression that it may sound quite strange, but Habermas used that expression, very strong expression, that all these postmodernist writers, they are neoconservative. Why neoconservative? Because they are decrying the notion of reason. They're totally dismissing the notion of reason, which I do not accept. So that way, Habermas was very strongly skeptical of Lyotard's argument, and that led to a serious debate. In fact, there is a correction. I have forgotten I remember the title of the book. It is, I think, Modernism, Postmodernism. I have forgotten the name of the editor. There actually you have the whole debate on Habermas, Habermas, Lyotard, Habermas's original text, then Lyotard's reply, then Habermas's counter reply. All these things are there. Regarding the notion of, say, yes, the question that you have raised at the very beginning. In fact, I have answered this question. That is, in fact, I think I should reframe it a bit. That point I did. Yes, you are very right. That is, in the age of social media and all these things, can we say that in India we are developing a notion of public sphere through our smartphones? So, are we developing a notion of public sphere? Now, we are sharing, definitely. We are sharing, we are at times arriving at consensus, at times we are disagreeing. But my question is very simple. In this age of social media, the kind of conversation in which we are engaged, well, are we really very authentic in the, say, in a, what I should say, in a, that is, are we very authentic in our conversations, in our speeches? In the sense, the way our consciousness, right from morning to night, we are being subjected, we are being, say, bombarded with, say, the kind of world, technology-driven world in which we are living. Are we really free in our conversation? Free in the sense, when we are speaking, the language in which we are speaking, the idioms that we are using, the vocabulary which we are using, this idiom, this vocabulary, our language, our body language, the way I am speaking. But am I not being unknowingly, in an invisible manner, guided by the media, guided by the TV? When I am, say, checking my email, or when I am browsing through internet, certain things, say, certain site, all of a sudden, certain ads pop up. Whether we like it or not, I have to wait for 3 or 5 seconds. Unless the ads vanish, we have to wait. So the point is that the way we are being bombarded, and there comes in the notion of ideology. And that reminds me of the great French philosopher Althusser, who said that it is ideology which actually constructs us, unknowingly or unknowingly. We are being manipulated, constructed, shaped, defined, identified. We are being given identity. And there actually Habermas, to a large extent, is relevant. That is the way capitalist modernity shapes us. So when we are saying that we are engaged in, say, social media in quite free space, are we really free? Is that space really free? Or is that space being, one person has raised this question, surveillance? In fact, we are under surveillance. Our internet is under surveillance. The way the present government is working out its agenda. So we are under surveillance. So we are, and I think, so far as the spirit of Habermas is concerned, very, very good. Yes, we should be engaged in rational conversation. But here again, I think a question arises that when we are talking of reason, say, is there any a concept of reason shared by all Indians? Say, for some, an act of, for some person coming from a certain section of society, an act of unreason, act of unreason is an act of reason. Say, sometimes what happens, for the ruling class, a particular act may be considered or treated as an act of unreason. But for those who have committed this act of so-called quote unquote unreason, is actually an act of reason, because their reasoning tells that this is the act of reason which should be adopted in accomplishing the goal. So that way, it's a very touchy question. It all depends on where you are located. in which section, in which strata of society, in a country like India, maybe in European context or in Western context, where you have a much more homogenized understanding of society, a homogenized understanding of culture. And there actually comes in the other question also, the notion of religion. Yes, certain in India, since whether we like it or not, we cannot escape the hold of religion. And for a large section of society, for the dominant section of society, it is the religious practices. I'm not talking of the philosophy of religion, but it is the religious practices, everyday practices, which actually prescribe what is reason and what is unreason. For me, certain religious, say, for instance, I do not believe in religion. And for me, certain religious practices in a particular religion may seem absolutely unreasonable. But a person who believes in that religion, for him, it is perfectly reasonable. So how in a society like India, we can think of a sort of universal reasoning which will all pervasive notion of reason? I think it's not just possible, not just possible. And that flows from, as I repeat, that flows from this typical Eurocentric mindset of Habermas. Not only Habermas, many other writers of the West, they are guided by this mindset. We have to understand our problem on our own terms. I'm never saying that the European concept, the Western concepts, they are irrelevant, not at all. We have to read, we have to understand. But we have to appropriate them in our own way. Not just mechanically trying to say that how can we fit Indian reality into Habermas? How can we fit the Indian thing in, say, Foucault's framework or Derrida's framework? This should not be our concern. Our concern is we have to understand our reality in our own way, and there, of course, we have to. If somebody says that I'm saying that no, you just need not read. Of course not. Of course not. You have to read Plato. You have to read Aristotle. You have to read Kant. You have to read Hegel. Everything. All the Western resources, rich resources, they enhance your knowledge. They actually widen your knowledge. Many great ideas, they flourished in the West. And our culture, Indian culture, that way is a part of world culture. So if that way, I cannot say that we have to be parochial, not at all. That will be dangerous, counterproductive. So that is more or less my response.
Okay, sir, I think there is a lot of conversation going on in the chat box, but I think we are running out of time. So
yes.
If you are okay, I mean,
Sure.
So
I fully understand that this kind of lecture, and on a highly controversial figure like Habermas, it will definitely raise questions, and it will and I'm happy that it has raised questions, that you are engaged in conversation, you are engaged in communication. So that way I think it is quite helpful. Yeah.
Yes, I can see Professor Kamal Chinoy also there amongst the audience.
Yes, I find after a long time. Kamal and Anuradha, both of them are there. Yes. My good old friends. Yes. Yes.
So
anyway, Monisha, it is now.
Yes. So let us call it a day. I was just wondering, sir, whether we can actually speak of one public sphere, because that itself brings a question to mind, because there's so many cultures and subcultures.
Yes.
for a future date, probably we can have a conversation on that. Sherin, will you propose the vote of thanks? No?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Shaili, yes, Shaili.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Sobhanlal Datta Gupta for making time for us today and for presenting us with an intensive view into the core philosophy of Habermas. For a philosopher as diverse as Habermas, whose work has stretched from socio-political theory, aesthetics, languages to theology, I believe that today's lecture has provided us with a foundational timeline behind his beliefs. Thank you so much, sir. I would also like to thank the head of our department, Dr. Manisha Madhwa, for her patience and help in organizing today's event. At last, I also extend my thanks to the rest of you for attending today's session and for your participation. Before we bring this session to an end, I would like to request you all to please fill the feedback form for today's lecture, whose link can be found in the chat box. This formally brings us to the end of today's edition of the monthly lecture series organized by the SNDT Women's University Department of Political Science. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure having you, and we look forward to more engagement and more communication with you, maybe in some future date, probably. And thank you for giving us your weekend. And thank you all the participants for giving an evening to us. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
And on my part, a very big thank you to Manisha, my former student, and for organizing this lecture, and to all the viewers, all the participants who have made. I was just looking at the chat box. It shows at least to some extent, perhaps my effort at least have not gone waste. So
no, sir.
To some extent, I have been able to make Habermas at least interesting to some of you. Whether I have been able to do justice to Habermas, that's a different question, because I never claim that I have really expertise in Habermas, but obviously Habermas I have to study, and very interesting, very controversial figure. That's it.
Yes.
Thank you very much. A very big thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Hope to get in touch with you again, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, sir. Have a
Bye-bye.
good day.